Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Mariela Colon, and I'm a librarian with the Civic and Cultural Engagement Department at the Chicago Public Library. Tonight's virtual event is part of our Latinx Heritage Month celebrations, as well as part of our Voices for Justice series, which seeks to highlight authors and thought leaders who can spark conversations in the areas of social justice. During tonight's program, we will be monitoring an online chat for questions from the audience for a brief Q&A following the conversation. So please feel free to ask questions in the chat. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for the evening, journalist Kelly Garcia. Kelly Garcia is a bilingual staff writer for the Chicago Reader, the city's biweekly alternative newspaper, where she writes about politics, police, and intra-community issues on the Southwest side. She was previously a summer reporting resident for Injustice Watch and a civic reporting fellow for City Bureau. She also has bylines at a variety of Chicago-based outlets, including The Tribe, Southside Weekly, and The Daily Line. She's from the sunny state of Florida, but has roots in Peru. I want to thank her for leading the discussion tonight. A reminder before I turn it over, we welcome your questions throughout tonight's program and we'll pose them to our speakers later this evening. Please place them in the Facebook chat or YouTube comments and I will pass them on. So with that, I'm happy to hand the program off to Kelly.
Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm super honored to be here. And now I get to turn it over to Julissa Arce. Julissa Arce is a writer, activist, and social change maker. She is the nationally best-selling author of My Underground American Dream and Someone Like Me. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Time Magazine, CNN, CNBC, Vogue, and other outlets. Her newest book, You Sound Like a White Girl, The Case for Rejecting Assimilation, is a powerful duo polemic and manifesto against the myth that assimilation leads to happiness and belonging for immigrants in America. Instead, she calls for a celebration of our uniqueness, our origins, our heritage, and the beauty of the differences that actually make us Americans. Prior to becoming an author and immigrant rights activist, Julissa built a successful career on Wall Street working for Goldman Sachs and Merrill Lynch and had seemingly achieved the American dream, yet she was not part of what legally defined an American. Julissa immigrated to America from Mexico at the age of 11 and was undocumented for almost 15 years, some of them spent rising to prominence on Wall Street. In order to help other young people in similar circumstances, she co-founded the Ascend Educational Fund. AEF is a college scholarship and mentorship program for immigrant students in New York City, regardless of their ethnicity, national origin, or immigration status. Julissa was named one of People en Español's 25 Most Powerful Women of 2017 and 2022, and 2018's Woman of the Year by the City of Los Angeles. She's a leading voice in the fight for social justice, immigrant rights, and education equality. Julissa serves on the board of directors of the National Immigration Law Center. She was officially sworn in as an American citizen in August of 2014 and currently lives in Los Angeles with her husband and their two cats, Nico and Pancho. Thank you so much for joining us here today, Julissa.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are here today to talk about your newest book, as we mentioned, You Sound Like a White Girl, The Case for Rejecting Assimilation. So I actually just finished the book recently, and I was just really, my breath was taken away by how powerful the message was. So thank you so much for writing that. But for folks who are tuning in and might not be familiar with the book yet, can you tell us a little bit more about it and what inspired you to write it?
Sure. So the book is a little bit of a departure from my previous two books. My first two books were memoirs, and so they really talked about sort of that story that you kind of shared in my bio of growing up undocumented, going to work on Wall Street, and it really focused on sort of those personal stories. Where this new book is much more of a manifesto, a polemic, a criticism of the way in which America sort of demands that immigrants and people of color assimilate, but doesn't really offer belonging, which is what it promises, but it never actually delivers. And so the first part of the book goes through the lies of assimilation, the lie of English, the lie of success, the lie of whiteness. And then the second half of the book is sort of about reclaiming those pieces of ourselves that we lose when we are trying to assimilate, So reclaiming our identity, our culture, and our history. I think for me, the book is ultimately a celebration of our culture, a celebration of sort of really celebrating like who we are and the roots that connect us here. So this book is a little bit different. To your question about what inspired me to write it, I think there were a few motivating factors. One, growing up, learning the history of the United States, I didn't often see Mexicans talked about in the history of the United States. And having grown up in Mexico and sort of learning about Mexican history, there was certainly mention of, the Mexicans that were in Texas and California and New Mexico before it became the United States. And so I knew that we had existed in this land. But when I was learning about it from the perspective of the United States, I didn't find myself in the history books that I was reading. And so this question, where were we? That question really stayed with me since I was in the 7th grade, all the way until I was an adult. And wanting to find the answer to this question was something that really motivated me to write this book, and why there's so much history that is woven into the book. And while there are some personal stories in the book, it really is much more about unearthing and revealing some of that history that I wish I had learned when I was growing up. So that was a really big motivating factor. The other, I think, I wrote this book wishing that I had had sort of like the knowledge in this book when I was growing up. Because I think, had I known all of these things when I was 15 years old, my life might have looked a lot different. I might not have struggled with some of the things that I struggled with. I might have more confidence to push back against certain things. And so I think those two things really drove me and motivated me to write this book.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. That really resonates with me as a young Latina growing up in Florida. I too similarly had no access or exposure to the history of my people. I'm Mexican, but also Peruvian and Puerto Rican, and I never learned about any of my cultures unless it was from my own family, right? Like from my
Right.
abuelos, my tios, like I would learn about our history, but I never learned about that in school really until I had the opportunity to go to college. And I took like some Latin American history courses. But like you said, this information was never really available publicly for me. And so because this information is not that widely available, I'm curious if you can tell me more about the research that went behind this book. Because one of my favorite parts of the book is that you interweave that historical background with your personal narrative. That is really difficult to do. So I'm just curious, one, how you did the research for the book, and how you chose what material to include.
Yeah. So when I first started thinking about this book, I was reading a lot of books about race and about identity in America. I was reading a lot of books about whiteness in America. And the interesting thing is that I was reading books like Working Towards Whiteness, like When the Irish Became White. And I guess I shouldn't have been surprised by this, but the way that these books framed the issue of race was very black and white, right? And it's as though there were sort of only this binary existed. And I still couldn't find, like, where did Mexicans fit into this conversation about race? Where did I fit into this conversation about race as someone who is not white, as someone who is not black, right? How does my identity fit into this conversation? And eventually, though, as I was reading this book, there would be like a little mention about the Mexican-American War and how the Mexican-American War changed things. And, I very much believe that the Mexican-American War is a defining moment in American history that we know like very little about. And yet it changed everything for everyone in this country. And so I started kind of, I would see this little like line about it, and then there would usually be a footnote of where, the person the people who wrote these books, where they got that information from. And so then I would go to the index and I would look up, where did this information come from? And that's how I started to eventually find books like Manifest Destinies by Laura Gomez, like An African American and Latinx History of the United States, books about the Mexican-American War, like The Wicked War, books about the lynchings of Mexican Americans along the Mexico-U.S. border by Texas Rangers, in a book called Gunpowder Justice. And so I started to find these books. And once I found those books, then they also had indexes where I could go and look up more material. And at some point, I was just reading so much. I was sort of learning so much about this history, that, to your second question about how did you decide what to put in, like, it was hard. It was really hard to decide, what history do I keep in here? What history is really important, but maybe I already have an example of this, so I don't need to include this other thing. And that was a very challenging part, sort of deciding what to keep in and what to take out. I think the other kind of interesting thing that happened is, because I was reading so much academic books, like so many academic books, my first draft of my book sounded very academic. And when I was kind of going through that first draft and I was reading it, I was like, why do I sound like I'm a professor? Like, this is not my voice, and not a voice that I write in. And so I kind of had to go back and comb through everything to say, if I was talking about this, how would I talk about it, right? If I didn't have this voice in my head, how would I write about this? And so that was sort of like the second iteration of it, was really taking this very academic concepts that, to your point, like many people only learn when they go to college, and really trying to talk about it in a way that was very accessible, in a way that I wish it had been written for me when I was younger, because I think that that's kind of part of the issue, is sort of only having access to this knowledge in places like higher education. I feel like this knowledge should be accessible to all of us in K through 12 education. We should be learning these things in K through 12 education, and we don't. And now, of course, there are so many new efforts to try to stop us from learning those things. There's a lot of times when we talk about sort of banned books, and somebody recently told me, well, you cannot ban the books that aren't published, right? And so many of our books are still not being published. So we can't even get banned because our books don't even exist yet, and so, yeah, like, I think that the research process was definitely like a multi-year process of like reading through these books, and then really pulling out the pieces that I wanted to write about. Sometimes it meant, like, well, at first when I started, it was like going to libraries, because some of this stuff doesn't even exist digitally. Like, some of the stories that I tell in the book, I even say, we are like at risk of really losing this history, because it's not even digital. It's still just hard paper, newspaper clippings, things like that. And then when I really sat down to start writing the book, it was March 2020, and we all know what happened March 2020. So I sort of really lost access to like a physical library. And I was really grateful for like academic journals that during the pandemic actually made it free to be able to access this academic journals that normally can cost hundreds of dollars for subscriptions to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that topic of the process of writing this book, because as I was reading this personally, I got teary-eyed many moments, because I was having to unpack a lot of the internalized racism and assimilation that I have. And so I'm very curious about what it was like for you personally to write this book, because you're unpacking not just generations of trauma, of colonization, of genocide, of racism. So I'm just curious, what was that like for you personally to write this book?
Yeah. So earlier today, I was doing like another virtual thing, and somebody had shared with me how they're like, when I read the book, I was like really angry, and then I was really sad, and then I was like really pumped up, and I just went through this like emotional roller coaster. And I was like, I went through that exact same emotional roller coaster when I was writing the book. I think that sort of that first draft sounded very angry because I was very angry about the things that I was learning. And I wasn't afraid to sound angry because I think sometimes that's part of it. People are like, if you're a woman and you're a woman of color, like you can't sound angry, you know? And I'm like, I was angry and you should be angry too, learning these things. But I also didn't want to stay in that anger, right? So there were moments when I also was very sad learning about some of the things that our people have gone through in this country. And then there were times when I was so motivated and so inspired by stories like the women in Crystal City, Texas, who had to fight for the right to bear pom-poms because their schools had a rule that only one of the 4 cheerleaders could be Mexican American, and the other cheerleaders had to be white in a school that was 85% Mexican American. Right. And so I was so motivated by learning the stories of these women. And then later on, I actually got to meet the women. And it was just an incredible time to like meet them and be able to tell them in person how their story changed my life and how it inspired me. So I definitely went through that whole emotional roller coaster. And then the other thing that was really difficult was I also had to be confronted with the ways in which I have helped to advance, white supremacy and whiteness, in the ways in which I had been taught to clamor for whiteness, right? And how at one point, I mean, the title of the book, You Sound Like a White Girl. The reason it's called that, it's because this boy, when I was 14 years old, that I had a crush on, told me that I sounded like a white girl. And he didn't mean it as a compliment, but I certainly took it as one. I really thought when I was 14 years old that sounding like a white girl was a good thing, right? That I had sort of like achieved something because I had tried for so long to get rid of my accent, to sound like the white girls at my school, to sound like the white girls that I saw on television shows and movies. And, sort of recognizing later on that sounding like a white girl when I am not a white girl was an idea meant to try to like contain me, right? To sort of try to define me in this sort of like narrow box, instead of being proud of my accent, instead of recognizing that the texture in my English tells a beautiful story about where I come from and who I am. And so, but it was also difficult to be like, there's a story that I share in the book. When I was, I don't know, must have been like 9 or 10 years old, living in Mexico, and being in El Zócalo with some of my classmates, and an indigenous girl came to sell us like gum, I think, and we all made fun of her. We all were like, "You don't even speak Spanish, right?" Right, to this indigenous girl, and sort of realizing like I am indigenous too. And in my insults, I was sort of trying to hide these sort of very white Mexican girls that I went to school with. I was trying to get them to like not see me as this indigenous girl too. Right. And so confronting those things about me and the ideas that I have also held in my mind was painful, to kind of have to confront, to look in the mirror and say, how have I help to advance these ideas? But I had to do that. I had to be very honest with myself, and I had to sort of say, these are the ways in which I have helped to advance it. And now, second part of the book, this is how I have tried to decolonize my mind, decolonize my ideas, and embrace something different.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Just to touch on the myriads of ways that we assimilate, that I picked up from your book. When you were talking about styling our hair, chopping off your Pocahontas hair, like I had similarly that experience, and having to straighten it every day just so that you fit in at school, or being picky about the kind of food that you brought to school as well. Like those are the experiences, right, that we had as Latinas in school. So I'm actually going to read an excerpt from the book that really stood out to me as well, that I'd love to ask you about. So at one point you say, it's not an easy task to unburden ourselves from all the lies we learned growing up, from the idea that we needed to shed our uniqueness in order to be worthy of the world around us. It's time we break free from the muzzles that keep us quiet for the sake of keeping others comfortable in their lies and power. We have to drop some knowledge so they don't continue to take from us. Today, I am armed with knowledge that allows me to stand in my truth, to push back, and to color deceitful information that keeps the illusion of white superiority alive. I thought that was a really beautiful excerpt. One thing that I thought a lot about when I was reading the book is how I would explain this to my mom. And I'm sure a lot of young Latinos could probably relate to that. I remember years ago sitting down with my mom, trying to just explain what anti-Black racism looks like in our community. And it was like, oh my God, it was like I had said something so offensive to her. I called her a racist and she just couldn't hear it, right? So I'm curious for people who are in that journey, right? This is ongoing, right? I don't expect to have a conversation with my mom and overnight that light bulb is gonna spark in her, right? But I'm curious if you have any advice for people who are just beginning to have that conversation with their family members, whether it's their parents, their tios or abuelos, their cousins, whoever. How do we approach our loved ones with these very challenging notions that you make in your book? How do we make the case to reject assimilation to our family members?
Yeah. I mean, it's difficult. I think that, our parents, whether they did it for protection, whether they did it, I don't believe that, like, my mom, for example, did any of what she did or things that she would say with any kind of like ill intent behind it, right? I think it was very much the ideas that were instilled in her, but then she tried to instill in us because they didn't know a different way. From coming to the US, my mom would tell me that the US was like una casa ajena, right? It was like somebody else's house. And when you go to somebody else's house, you're on your best behavior and you don't say anything. If something smells, you're not going to be like, señora, como que huele feo su casa. You're just going to like keep your mouth quiet. You're going to just like suck it up and not say that something smells bad in their house. I view the United States very differently. I do very much believe that this is my house and that when something is wrong, I want to go fix it because I live here and this is my home and I want to make it better. That is a very different perspective than what my mom's perspective was about the United States. I'll also say that, these ideas about whiteness, like the United States didn't invent them. These ideas live and exist in other places of the world. In the book, I talk about sort of learning the idea that whiteness was important, even in Mexico, right? Because, we have phrases in Mexico that we say like, no hagas eso porque pareces India, right? Like you look indigenous doing that. Or, I'm sure people have heard the phrase like, cásate con un güerito para mejorar la raza. Tenemos que mejorar la raza. Like we have to better the race. For me, it was about kind of stopping and thinking like, where did these ideas come from? Like how were they invented? Who started to sort of say these things and why are they so deeply embedded in our communities? And, when it comes to like bettering the race comments that people make, that comes from the caste system, right? And it comes from a period of time during colonization where literally the only way that you could move up the caste system was to marry someone who was lighter skinned than you, someone who was in closest proximity to having been born in Spain, to being a white Spaniard who was born in Spain. And that was sort of like the goal, right? And then maybe somebody who was Spanish, but who was born in Mexico, that was the next level down in the caste system, and so on, where Black people and Indigenous people were all the way at the bottom of that caste system. And you could never move up that caste system unless you married someone who was in a different caste system than you were. And so this idea of like bettering the race by marrying someone lighter skinned has a historical root. It has a historical place of where it started and why people did it for survival, to have a better life, right? Now, the caste system has been dead for centuries, and yet we allow these ideas to continue to live in our minds and to continue to dictate the way in which we live our lives, right? I had this conversation with my mom where she told me that my nephew, she said to me, está bien bonito tu sobrino porque está bien güerito. And he's really cute because he is really light-skinned. And so I had to stop her and say, Mommy, like, he's not cute because he is light-skinned. He's just cute. Like, he's just a cute baby. And him being light-skinned has nothing to do with whether or not he's cute. I was like, what about like my brother? What about me? Like, we're prietitos, you know, like we're not light skinned. Like, are we not cute? Are we not pretty? Are we not handsome because we're not light? And she was like, no, no, like, of course you are, you know, you are. And so it's sort of like explaining to her. And I had this whole conversation where I explained the caste system, I explained why these ideas are racist, I explained why these ideas are actually putting ourselves down, you know? When we say like, when we sort of prop whiteness up on a pedestal and then we look at ourselves in the mirror and we're not that, then we are putting ourselves down. You know, we are taking part in our own oppression by continuing to propel these ideas. And I had this whole conversation with my mom, and I think at the end of it, you know, she was still sort of saying, yeah, but your nephew's really cute because he's being güerito, you know, or like, look how cute, look how güerito he is, look how great it is that he's güerito, you know. And so to your point, like, it's gonna take like several conversations. And I think for me, coming to these conversations from a place of love and from a place of um tenderness, like, I don't believe my mom is this like racist person against indigenous people. I believe that she was taught something when she was young, and she was taught to value, you know, to value sort of saying my grandpa was a Spaniard, you know, and like really valuing that versus like my indigenous grandma. Like, why aren't we proud of our indigenous grandparents? You know, and so I very much believe she's been taught these things. And you know, my mom is 70 years old. Like, it's not gonna take one conversation to undo all of these decades of believing one thing and something that was really like instilled in her, you know. So I think just coming to it from a place of, like I said, love and tenderness, and like, I almost feel like sad, you know, like I feel sad that my mom had to grow up like this, that she had to grow up with these ideas, and that she never had the opportunity to break free from them. And so when I come to the conversations with that kind of thinking, instead of like, I know better than you know, I'm going to teach you something, but really of wanting to have a conversation, I think those conversations are much, much better received.
While reading the book, I really felt like you were talking to me directly. And I think you made a point about that in your book as well, right? Like you were very, very intentional about who the audience was. But I'd like to hear from you, especially for people here who may not have read the book yet. You know, who is your audience? And can you explain why did you choose us as your audience? Why not explain it to non-Latinos who might not know any of this? Why us?
Yeah. You're right. Like, I was very intentional. You know, things like the Spanish in the book is not italicized, and it's also not translated. If it was sort of like a natural thing to sort of say the translation in context, then I did, but I never went out of my way to translate anything. Because I think, you know, when I read books in English, even now, there are words that I have to Google and there are words that I have to look up. So, you know, if somebody doesn't sort of quite get what a sentence is here or there, I think they too can, you know, open up Google and see what I meant to say there. And I did that very intentionally because I think that there's this idea that has been circulating for some time now, that we have to preach beyond the choir, right? That if we want to create change, we have to preach beyond the choir. And I certainly do think it's important to have conversations with people who don't always think the same. I do think it's important to, you know, to change conversations. However, I think that for me personally, I don't want to spend my time convincing someone of my humanity, right? So like, if you are so far away in this conversation that you're over here thinking that I'm not even human, that I don't even deserve the same rights that you do, then I personally feel like I don't have any business talking to you, because there's really nothing I can say. There's no facts that I can give you. There's no statistics that I can cite. There's no personal stories, heartwarming personal stories that I can tell you. You might never change your mind. So why am I over here sort of trying to convince you when there's like all of these people that also need to be spoken to, right? That also need to feel inspired, need to feel empowered, need to have this knowledge so that they do feel empowered. And to me, those are much more rewarding conversations to have. And so that's why, I say in the book, like, I wrote this book for the choir. If you are part of the choir, like, this book is for you. That's not to say that, people outside the community can't come to the book and like learn a lot. And I think people have. But I did not write the book for them. I didn't write the book to explain things to white people so that white people could sort of see me and think like, oh yeah, she's American too. I'm really glad that a lot of white people have picked up the book. Thank you for that. And I think that, but for me, like, I wanted to write this book for us because I think there are very few books that are written for us, that center our stories, that center our experiences. And I wanted people who have been through the things I've been through to feel seen and to feel like at least one other person has been through this. And I'm not crazy for feeling the things that I have felt growing up because they're real.
Yeah, thank you for that. Um, these topics can also be very heavy. I think in your book, like I said earlier, I got really emotional reading about a lot of the trauma that we've endured and from our ancestors to, our most close family members now. So I'm curious, where do you find joy in this work? When you're reading and writing about a lot of our experiences that are heavy and hard and to go through, how do you find joy in all of this?
Yeah. I mean, the stuff that I'm learning and the stuff that I'm writing in and of itself, like, it might not feel very joyous because, as you said, like, it is very heavy things, it is very, like, the history hasn't always been like pretty and motivating and inspiring. A lot of times that history has been very angering and very sad. Like, it's been very sad to learn about some of the things that I didn't know, but I still find a lot of hope in the fact that I am learning this history. And I find a lot of hope in that I am helping to unearth some of this history and to share it with people who may have never learned it had it not been because they read it in this book called You Sound Like a White Girl, right? And maybe people picked up the book because the title is catchy or the cover is like bright and pink and like it stands out. For whatever reason that people come to the book, I find a lot of joy in having these conversations. And all of the book events I've had since the book came out, I've just been it's been such a joyous experience to see out into the crowd and like people showed up. Like, my events have like been sold out because people showed up. People were there to support the work. They were there to be in community with one another. And the majority of the people that have come to my events have been Latinas, right? And so, like, to look out and to say, I never needed to change anything about myself. I never needed to like give up anything about myself. It is actually my community that is elevating me to every place I've ever wanted to go. Like, there's so much joy in that. There's so much hope in that. There's so much happiness in that. And so I'm constantly uplifted by our community. I'm constantly uplifted by Bad Bunny. And I say Bad Bunny because, when he said, when he won his Artist of the Year at the MTV Music Awards, and he was the first person who doesn't sing in English to win the award in the entire history of the awards. And he said he always knew he was going to be one of the biggest stars in the world and that he was going to do it without changing his culture and without changing his language. And I think, wow, like, yes, it is us who are filling 40,000 people stadium, selling out, making him the #1 streaming artist in the world. Like, we're doing that. We have the power to do that. And if we can do that with Bad Bunny, think about all the things we can do.
Yeah, absolutely. So for people who are just starting this book now, what is one thing that you hope they can take away? Or maybe I know you mentioned some earlier titles earlier, but maybe some recommendations for people who are maybe this is their first time talking about assimilation or reading about it. So what are some other recommended readings for people who are just starting?
Yeah. So, it's funny because I don't really have like a thing that I want people to take away from the book. I certainly know what I took away from writing it, but now it's sort of the exciting part about writing a book is that now I get to turn it over to you. And you actually get to tell me what you got out of it. You get to tell me what resonated, how what emotional journey you went through when you read the book, and so I just hope that people come to the book with sort of an open mind. And that's really my only ask, is I come to the book with an open mind. Um, in terms of recommendations, I would definitely recommend Manifest Destinies by Laura Gomez, an African American Latinx History of the United States by Paul Ortiz. There's a lot of poetry in the book. In my book, there's a lot of epigraphs. So every chapter starts with an epigraph, and usually that epigraph is poetry. I am not a poet. I so admire poets who can say so much with such few words. I look at a poem, and I think it took me a whole chapter to say what you're saying in a paragraph. And that's why there's so much poetry in the book. So books like Citizen Illegal by Jose Olivares, who's actually a Chicago native. Um, you know, Poetry books like that kind of really inspired me quite a bit. And they tackle, I think he tackles some of these issues about identity. Um, there's a poem that I quoted in my book where he talks about Mexicanos and like the different kinds of Mexicanos, like the Mexicanos from Mexico, who are not to be confused with like the Mexican Americans, who are not to be confused with like Chicanos. And he goes into this whole thing about identity. And I think it's just a beautiful book. So yeah, I would say like those three books would be books that I'd recommend for people who are starting on this journey.
Great, thank you so much for that. I know it's a little early, but I believe we do have questions as well from people on Facebook. So if you're watching live from Facebook, you can drop some questions into the comments and we will be able to read them on here as well. But yeah, so one question is, how do you balance your activism and your writing? It seems like both are so incredibly demanding.
Yeah, well, I think for me, these two things are sort of like um, they go like hand in hand. It's like ketchup and fries. Like to me, these two things are um, they're not one and the same, but they do very much go hand in hand. I do think that my writing is part of my activism, right? And I also get out so much from my activism, and it makes me really consider different things. It really makes me reflect on things that sometimes then I go and write about, right? Like I go write about the experiences I've had going to a rally or going to a march or going to lobby in Congress for specific laws to pass. And so yeah, to me, like these two things go hand in hand. And like for me, like I try to divide my year into like months, and those months are times when I'm doing different things. Like right now, Hispanic Heritage Month, Latina Heritage Month, Latino Heritage Month, whatever word you like to use best. This is like I do not get any writing done during this month, during the fall. Like September through the end of October, I will not be writing. Like I'm lucky if I write a little bit here and there when I'm on a plane or something, but I already know that this time of the year, like I'm not going to get a lot of writing done. When it's like the summer and the winter, that's when I can start thinking about what am I going to write next, to start doing some of this research. And so I kind of try to divide my year by times when I am writing, by times when I am sort of out in the community. With my scholarship fund, it's sort of May and June when we are reading applications, when we are letting people know actually when we're reading applications for the scholarship fund, and when we're interviewing candidates for the scholarship fund. So I already know, those few weeks I have to carve out time to read the applications for the scholarship recipients. and so I have to be very organized, I suppose, to try and do all the different things that I feel like very much are part of my purpose to do.
Sounds great. Well, thank you so much, Julissa, for joining us here today. I really appreciated learning all about this. And for those of you who haven't had a chance yet to check out the book, please do. I actually have the one from the library, so if you're waiting on that one, I'm sorry, you'll get it. You'll get it soon. We need more copies, but yes. Thank you so much, Julissa. I really appreciated this conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much. And please stay connected. If you do have more questions, feel free to send them to me on Instagram, on Twitter. I really appreciate the conversations. It's been really wonderful.
Great.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. And thank you so much, Julissa Arce and Kelly Garcia. Thank you so much for doing such a great job moderating. It was such a great event. Julissa Arce's book is You Sound Like a White Girl, and you can check it out at the Chicago Public Library, like Kelly, or you can check it out at any of your local libraries, but we also encourage you to visit independent bookstores to purchase a copy. Tonight's program will be available on the Chicago Public Library YouTube and Facebook page. If you have friends who weren't able to join us tonight, please invite them to watch it on demand. And please visit the Chicago Public Library website for many more upcoming virtual events at chipublib.org. Thank you, Julissa and Kelly, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. Have a great night and stay well.